you. Okay, all right, everybody can hear me. Awesome. All right, so it's not often I do workshops to masses like this, so this is a bit of a fun experiment for me. But what I want to do is show you one of the tools that I often use when I start a lot of engagements with large-scale organizations. And it's just an exercise called 10 Principles of Business Transformation. I wrote this blog post probably about maybe 2.5 years ago. I can't really remember. I've got a 5-month-old, so I don't really sleep that much. But so what I'm going to do is just share you the techniques that I use to try and get people thinking about when you're trying to transform these organizations, what are the aspects we need to consider, right? So I want everybody to focus on the current initiative that you're either leading, you're participating in. And as I'm going through these principles, I want you to sort of jot down a couple of notes. So there's a worksheet in front of you. It's got 10 boxes in it. And maybe, when I'm talking about one of these principles, just jot down, what are some obstacles you're facing in that area? Or some of the things that are maybe working well for you in that area. And I just want you to sort of take a few notes as you go along. And then what we'll do is I'll get you to sort of swarm in little small groups and maybe share a little bit with one another about what you come up with at the end of that. And then we'll go through a few iterations where I'll get you to sort of identify 1 or 2 areas you want to focus on, and then how you can start to design good experiments to start moving in a direction to make things a little bit better, okay? What often happens when I do this with people, though, is a lot of people start feeling a little bit overwhelmed when they start to think about how much things are moving when they're working on a transformation. And part of the point of this is to help you use this as a thinking tool to get all your ideas down, but then use it and apply a lot of what we call agile lean principles and limit the amount of areas in progress you're trying to change. Get very focused on the experiment that you're going to try and work on to move your system just a little bit more forward. All right, so I'll do a little bit of a talk probably for about 20 minutes just to sort of set some context on what each of these principles are. Then we'll do a little bit of workshopping where you'll talk to the person beside you. Then you'll go into a group of 4, and then we'll ask some people to report back. And then we'll cycle on another little bit of a talk and then another bit of workshop after that. Does that sound okay to people? All right, cool, awesome. So principle number 1 is this: think big, start small, and learn fast. So one of the things I often find when I'm working on these transformations is it's very, very important to have a big aspiration or outcome that you're trying to achieve. If you don't have an inspiring vision about what you're trying to do and how you know you're going to be successful, it's very difficult to get people bought in and want to be part of the initiative that you're leading. But counterintuitively, often when we have these big visions, people think that we need to think big, build big, but that actually makes us too big and often too big to fail. And this is one of the biggest challenges. So counterintuitively, with a lot of the work that we do, it's important to have a big vision, but then start small. And the reason we start small is because it limits risks, it forces fast feedback loops, and that allows us to learn fast. If our bigger hypothesis, our big vision, with a small experiment, it gives us information to start understanding, are we moving in the direction that we want? And it makes us safe to fail. So really, really important. Now, one of my favorite sort of big aspirations at the moment is these types of visions, right? Elon is setting an aspirational vision beyond ourselves, right? To take humanity to another planet. And it's understandable to people what success is. Can we get to Mars? So does anybody know how SpaceX, while this is thinking big, does anyone know how they started? Does anyone know the first things that they did? Did they go and buy rockets and start going to space on day 1? Okay, everybody needs to read Elon's biography. It's awesome. So what he did is he got 6 people. They moved out into a tiny island on the Pacific, and they literally set up camps and started launching tiny little rockets just straight up to see if they could actually start iterating rapidly on building really, really small rockets. And these people lived on an island in the Pacific. Whenever they had a problem with any of their devices, Elon was kind enough to use his private jet to fly resources out to them. But for the most part, that's how they started, right? They started thinking big about going to Mars, but started really, really small. 6 people living, literally camping on an island, isolated island in the Pacific, launching rockets into the sky to learn fast if what they could do was successful or not. But definitely check out Elon's biography. It's an awesome book. Number 2, secure a mandate and sponsorship for support. So what I find is when you're working in these organizations, you can only be as effective as the level of support that you often have in these organizations. So when you don't have supportive senior leaders in the organization, you can be as effective as the sort of triage that you can create. But it's a sort of two-sided street for most people. It's also about you securing the most senior leadership support you can get to create space. But everybody at this conference is also a leader. And it's about you creating space to allow these sort of innovations to happen. Now, this is a very privileged role. So what I normally do when I start transformations is I go around and I give all the senior leaders a very important device to help them understand when they are trying to create this space, what the job is about. And it's called this. So your job is to be a shit umbrella, basically, to protect people from different types of stuff that comes at them. And you may notice that there's a really small Amazon affiliate link here. So what I do is when I start these transformations, I go around to a lot of the senior leaders and I hand these umbrellas out to them. And I help them understand that your job is going to have to create the space for these things. So anybody who buys one of these awesome umbrellas using this link, the money goes back into a pot that I reinvest in handing these umbrellas back out to people. So if you want to think big and start small and help transform organizations, you can buy one of these umbrellas and I'll let you know it's going to a good cause. The next one I think about is right people and right place. And this is really important about when you're trying to find and start these initiatives. It's about finding the right mix of a team and people in the organization who are willing to innovate, who are open with change, who are comfortable with change. But it's also trying to find initiatives in your organization what will allow you to iterate and create evidence quite quickly. Now, most people will probably be familiar with this diagram from Geoffrey Moore, which talks about the different life cycles of innovation. You have your innovators over here and your laggards over here. And while this is based in technology, I try to think about this also as people. So when you have different people in the organization, you have the natural innovators who just anything that comes out want to get involved with, and then you have the laggards on the other side. Now, when I'm designing teams to lead these transformations, I really be intentional about, do I have the right mix of people over here to sort of create this sort of transformation? If you put people who are adverse to change or laggards into a high change environment, you break the people, you don't break the systems of work. So really what I'm constantly trying to think about is just don't have a load of people here. You need people to have a good balance of what you're trying to do. Similarly, when you're starting to think about the initiative that you're focused on, what's going to allow you to iterate quickly, but will also have enough credence that the senior sponsorship want to be a part of it, want to protect space for it, and then identify where you're going to start your initiative. So a couple of things to think about there. Most important thing, act your way to a new culture. So often when we talk a lot about transformation, and I always hear this as leaders say that we have a mindset problem. We just need to shift our mindset. So we need to think differently. And because Apple created this great ad called Think Differently, everybody thinks that if you want to change behavior, you just have to think differently. But unfortunately, that's a fallacy and a bit of a fail. If you want to shift your mindset, you actually have to start by acting differently, by behaving in a different way. And when you start to behave in a different way, you get a different perspective from using those behaviors. And that perspective then runs new information against your existing mental models of the world. And you see different results. And that's what makes you shift your mindset. So if you're trying to transform your organization, the most important thing you can do is start acting differently to get a different perspective, to shift your mindset. And because your mindset starts to change from these new behaviors, it's an accelerant. It makes you sort of continually change your behaviors. So, and the first people to sort of come across this was really Shook. Right, so John Shook was the first American to be hired by Toyota. He moved to Japan, couldn't speak a word of Japanese. He wanted to work under the Toyota production system. And what he found is that in America, it was still this idea of the way we change is we sit in a 2-day certified Scrum Maniac course, and then on the 3rd day, we change our behavior. Well, it doesn't work like that. You actually have to act in a different way. And that's what starts to make you change your perspective. And this is why when Toyota were inviting GM into the factories, and GM were running around taking photos of everything, thinking that they were giving away a competitive advantage. But remember, a photo to Toyota was just a snapshot in time. Their system of work would change every day because people were constantly experimenting. They had the famous Andon cord. Are people familiar with the Andon cord? So basically what happens at Toyota is when somebody finds a problem or an issue or a mistake in the system of work, they pull this cord. And then the manager comes over and they design an experiment together to remove that obstacle and improve the systems of work. So it's constantly innovating. When GM came in and took all these photos and rebuilt the one-page diagram about how to be Toyota production system compliant, they rebuilt the Andon cord and it would just sit above the people in GM. They had no idea. It just was in their way. They didn't understand. It didn't change behavior. So again, it's really, really important when you're thinking about things is what are the behaviors that you start acting differently that are going to impact the mindset that you're trying to create. The next one is build the right thing, then build it the right way. And this sort of ties into the starting small and learning fast philosophy. Is often when we're dealing with these complex, unpredictable, and uncertain initiatives, is we should figure out that we're actually building the right thing before we start to scale what we're trying to do. Or more specifically, validate the problem, and then once we validated a problem, let's validate our solution to that problem, and then let's validate how we scale that solution if needed. And this is how Eric Ries basically became a millionaire overnight. He drew a picture of a circle, and he basically said, if you build something and measure something and learn something, you're going to be awesome. And everybody runs out there going, oh, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn. But build, measure, learn is actually incorrect. What we're trying to do is actually figure out what we need to learn about it. We have a hypothesis. What information do we need to learn to find out if that hypothesis is true or not? And once we know what we need to learn, then we can devise an experiment to test that hypothesis and build something, and then measure if we actually achieve the outcomes that we want. So next time you hear someone say build, measure, learn, please pause them and go, it's actually learn, measure, build is what we're trying to do. And do proper scientific experimentation, as Dave called out earlier. And then everybody has our favorite, most conflated word in the industry, minimum viable product. And then using these sort of items of small, vertically sliced, as Belinda showed in her cake, things that actually test end-to-end what you're trying to create. And then you're trying to build those through safe-to-fail experiments by creating cross-functional teams, using your customers, and then going through that feedback loop as quickly and fast as possible to make pivot or perv decisions. The way you make stuff safe to fail is you start small, is you limit your investment, you limit your resources, because that forces a feedback loop to happen. You set boundaries, might be physical boundaries, might be economic boundaries, it might be time-based boundaries that force feedback loops to happen. And that allows you to start to iterate quickly and learn what works and what doesn't, learn fast. So I work with tons of different companies. This is one of the companies I work with that most people probably in London are familiar with. So does anyone here work in the airline industry? One person, oh, 2 people, all right, 3, awesome. Hello everybody from the airline industry. So a classic industry, heavily regulated, very difficult, big legacy systems. Does anyone know the lead time for the average software deployment in the airline industry? This is the pop quiz, you can just guess. 18 months, good. Any more? 24, great. That's basically the 2 ends of the spectrum. That's awesome. 18 to 24 months is the average lead time for software deployments in the airline industry. And so, we were working with British Airways, and they were trying to come up with ways to innovate their business. And one of the transformational ideas that they had was group booking. Awesome, right? So how exciting would it be to be the product manager in British Airways where you're like, we're going to do group booking. And then the feedback you get is, yeah, it's going to take 18 to 24 months, 200 people, and about $150 million. Do you want to build it? Right? Pretty scary. But again, this is this idea of before we start to build these things is we should first validate there's a demand for these ideas. So what's the smallest, fastest, cheapest thing that we can do to find out if there's actually a problem worth solving here? Then if we can validate that problem, what's an efficient way that we can start to validate a solution and then start to worrying about scaling a solution? All right, so if you were going to, this is everyone's chance to be a part of this team. If you were going to build group booking, how would you start to figure out if you can build the right thing? What would you do? Speak to customers. Good. What else?
Look at the prior booking data to see whether there's evidence of group bookings.
Okay, good. Look at the prior booking data. See if there's evidence of group bookings. Great. What else?
Put a link on the website.
Put a link on a website. Awesome. Great. Any more? How could I, sorry? Define a group that you target. Okay. Oh, what a group is. Okay, define a group. Okay, thank you. Yeah. How can you make it really, really small? How can you make it safe to fail? Do it manually. Great. Okay, these are all great, great answers. Right, so what we did to think big, group booking, start small, learn fast, is we picked one route. So between London and San Diego on one flight. And we sent an offer to everybody on that flight and said, if you can show us some basic information to you're traveling as a group, we'll give you a discount of between 5 to 10% on your trip. Right, so we sent this email out to see if there was any demand. See if it's a problem that people had and something that was worth solving in a really small, controlled way. And give us a fast feedback loop. Right, help us understand. So there was enough demand for us to go forward, right? We were excited that we saw enough demand. So then we were starting to thinking about validating a solution. So how could you start to validate that solution or test out that solution? So in every company, there's always like this one person, and I always find this, and I try, my main time to finding this person is one of my KPIs actually on these initiatives. There's always one person who just knows how everything works, right? And they've always been in the company for like 25 years, and they started on the shop floor, and they've been all over the place. And in British Airways, it's a lady called Jan, and Jan knows how literally every system works, right? So talked to Jan about this idea, and we sat down and watched her manually go through all the different processes that were involved to make this transaction work. Because you have to remember, software is just an automation of a manual process. All we're doing is automating manual processes. So before we start going to even software, we should understand if a manual process or concierge process makes sense. And the really interesting thing about doing that is you start to understand where are the local maximums of all the systems on that lead time or that value stream. And it's only when people start to actually feel pain with some of the manual processes that you should even think about trying to automate them, until you can validate that you have enough demand and that your solution, or manual solution, is so limiting and you have so much demand for scale that you should start to automate. So by using this process of starting really small, sending emails out to a group of people, using Jan's excellence to sort of figure out and turn all these dials, we were able to understand the different systems that had governance, risk, and compliance implications. We were able to involve legal in the processes where we needed to automate or not. This went live in 18 weeks, which was literally transformational for the airline industry. And using these tools to start to experiment very specifically about thinking big, starting small, and learning fast, and then automating where you want. So stuff to think about in your business. The next one is like delivering small, fast, frequent to build momentum. And this is one of the most important and powerful parts of working in small batches that we've already heard a lot from today. Because it enables you to learn and optimize about what's working and what's not. So one of the most important things for me is when you do have a proof point, you also need to have a scaled out plan about what you're going to do next. So once you know the first most riskiest area you're targeting, how are you going to scale out your platform over time? Who are the people that you need to engage and target? How are you going to execute at speed? And understand from a technology, customer, and commercial perspective what that's going to bring to your company. This is what's important for your business stakeholders to understand how your little prototype turns into something that's going to have an impact on the valuation of their business. But the other thing that's really important about working in small batches is something I call trust cadence. And this is really, really important when you're trying to show a new way of behaving, acting your way to new cultures in your organization. Is because if you're constantly showing things to your stakeholders for feedback, saying, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of this? You build a behavior that they start to understand that you ship regularly, or you ask for feedback and course correction regularly. It's not like these big batches of 6 monthly releases where you come up with some requirements and disappear and invariably come back with variants about what they expected and what you thought you would deliver. One of the most powerful ways to build trust is constantly engage your stakeholders for feedback throughout the process. And it's even better is when you start to build those feedback loops in with your customers, because they are the best people to help you navigate the uncertainty. And how you're engaging your customers and what you're using to work with them becomes a really, really powerful process to go through. And I start to think about with all the teams I work with, is I generally try to have from leadership level right down to the shop floor, people regularly spending time with customers, showing progress of the ideas that are working and not working. And it becomes a very powerful mechanism for your leaders, because if you can help them understand that the vision for your company is also a hypothesis, that the strategy you have for your company is a hypothesis, that the products and services that you build for your company are experiments to test the hypothesis of your vision and your strategy, and that you're really trying to iterate at speed, it becomes a really powerful way for you to engage senior stakeholders, because they want to make great decisions. And if you can help them understand a way to test their strategy is actually to build small experiments or small products and learn what works and what doesn't with customers, super powerful way to engage them, because they want to make good decisions, and to make good decisions, you need good data. Because this is what we're trying to do. And this is ultimately the powerful part, is how can we adapt based on what we're learning? And the big challenge for most organizations is that they can't adapt. The feedback loops are so slow, the information quality is so poor, that they can't make good decisions to get there. Most companies are trapped in what I call the plan-do act, or the plan-do loop. Right, so who's here going through annual planning at the moment, actually? It's a good time of year for annual planning, isn't it? November? It's finished, well done, good job, great. Most people probably won't get their budget signed off until March, I'm going to argue. And if they're lucky, then they start executing their plan. And, halfway through the year, you've got to do the replan. And then when you get towards this time of year again, and people are asking, how's that plan going? You're like, don't worry about this year's plan. I'm working on next year's plan. Right? So we're constantly just like planning and executing and chasing our tail. And what really high performance organizations are doing is they're building these feedback loops into everything. They're constantly adapting. They're working in smaller iteration cycles and allowing them to learn what works and what doesn't. The higher the uncertainty, the faster and smaller your feedback loop should be. So when you're working on highly exploratory projects and initiatives, you should be iterating weekly, for instance. When you're working on stuff that's a bit more understood, maybe monthly, whatever, you choose those cadence. But for me, most organizations are trapped in what I affectionately call as annual fuzzy water can, Scrum continuous fall ban delivery ops. Yeah, thank you. You can a little clap for that one, it's always good. Right, because, and they tell me they've got agile teams, and I'm like, sweet. And they're like, when do you deploy software? Oh, they're like, no, there's dev complete. It's awesome. Agile teams, dev complete, we're done. Then we still got this horrific centralized QA, and ops always break everything. And then over here, we've got the fuzzy front end, which is the whole planning process that takes months. Speed is end to end. Right? Your lead time that counts is from here to the feedback that goes back to here. That's the stuff that matters. So I coached the executive team of one of America's largest banks. And we were trying to cut this planning cycle down for them. They're spending an average about 4 months of their total cycle time available to them in planning meetings, which is just like, that's like over 30% of your time just sitting around people coming up with ideas that they don't even know are true or not. So we tried to flip the way that they did planning and got leaders talking about outcomes that they're trying to achieve. What if we are business agility? If we have business agility, how would we know? What would be some of the things that we would see? So the best way to get people to shift from an output to an outcome-based model, it's very hard for people to jump straight to magic metrics. Everyone asks me about what's the magic metrics to make me a lean enterprise or business agility or whatever flavor they want to be. It's unique to your company. It's what matters to your company. It's what people define as what matters. So the way I sit down with the executive team of this bank is I ask them, tell me some stories. If we have true business agility, what are some of the things that would be happening? And amazing thing happens when you ask people to tell stories, is they start saying things like, well, our customers would use our product more. And they'd start being happier with our products. They'd buy more of our products. Actually, they'd recommend more of our products. Our teams would say collaboration is better. They'd deploy more software. They'd actually, they'd start actually offering up more ideas back to the company. Now, the really interesting thing about all of what I just shared there is I'm just describing behaviors. I'm sharing examples of what behaviors you would see if you were actually achieving the outcome that you were aiming for. Now, the great thing about when people describe behaviors is what? So behaviors are observable. And if they're observable, they're measurable. And then you only have to ask people, well, how frequent are these behaviors happening? Or relative to what they're happening now, how much more are they happening? So very quickly, the executive team flipped from saying, well, if we actually have business agility, we'll know because 80% of our customers say the service quality has gone up. 80% have solved their first issue first time. The things that matter to them, how will we know our teams are actually better? Well, they'll agree that things have improved. So all they've discovered or described is what success looks like. And then they stop. They shut up. And then they ask their teams to figure out how can we get there. They actually use the 50,000 brains that they pay on a monthly basis to go figure out these problems, and this is the direction we're aiming for. So their planning process is cut down from like 4 months to literally 6 weeks. And the teams are actually testing that hypothesis and giving feedback about what's realistic, what's not, and adapting as they go. 30% year-on-year growth for the last 4 years for that company. Outstanding. Demonstrate evidence to get future investments. And this is really about showing your work. What works, what doesn't? Are we seeing evidence of things working? And if we are, we double down on this. And it's really, really important, right? Like, how often has anyone been on a project that's got stopped in the first month because you realized that what you were building was not actually working? Right? Less than maybe 1% of the crowd. And this is what's actually killing our industries because we're over-investing. We're in this plan-do loop, and we're not doing plan-do check-act loops. We're not using things to learn fast and make course adjustments. And again, Diane Reinerson was saying 50% of the time is spent with people sitting in meetings arguing over who's correct and who's wrong. And this, again, I think Dave showed a little bit of this Forrester report by ThoughtWorks. It's one of my favorite ever Forrester reports, simply because they asked a whole load of leaders, how do you make decisions in your company? And these this is great. 47% said, oh, basically a committee decides, so we make stuff up. 24% said that they have some sort of financial modeling, economic modeling, great. 13% said, the hippo decides. It's pretty funny. Then there's this idea of a product portfolio approach, which I think was just like people put in for fun, but apparently 9% of people do that. And then there's like 7 honest people who are like, oh yeah, we've no approach as to how we do this. So it gives you a sense that maybe less than a quarter of our industry actually has some economic-based system for making investment decisions. And I heard a lot, like everyone holding up Amazon as this great company. Does anyone know what Jeff Bezos did before he started Amazon? Anyone? He worked in hedge funds. So he understands the power of things like optionality. How do I make lots of small bets in my portfolio? How do I pay for information to understand what works and what doesn't, and learn quickly about what works and what doesn't? And the bets I make, some of them are going to fail, but I'll learn cheaply that that was a bad bet, and the ones that work will pay off, and I'll make big hits and returns from it. This is the power of optionality. Does anyone here work in high-frequency trading in this room or banking industry? Start applying the same methods that you use to manage the complexity and uncertainty of the market on the way you manage your work. I literally spend so much time with executives talking to them. If you want to connect with your business stakeholders in the financial services industry, talk to them about these types of using optionality, methods that they understand to manage the complexity of the market is the way that they manage their transformation work as well. Really powerful. And some examples of this, I work with all these types of companies. This is a great example from is that ThoughtWorks. It's like the New York Times have hundreds of examples of, if you ever want to go and find an engaged customer, you should go to the opinion section of the New York Times. That's basically where everyone is on there going, hey, guess what, your product sucks, you need to fix it this way. They've hundreds of ideas a day about how they could improve their services. But what they wanted to do was act their way to a new culture. They wanted to create a system that allowed them not to find the one great idea and invest in that, a system that they could test hundreds of ideas to find out which are the duds and which are the ones that will actually pay off massively. And the simple constraint they set was how they'd pick 3 ideas, a short sprint of 6 weeks, with 3 teams, and they'd rapidly test these ideas to quickly find out what worked and what didn't, double down on the things that did, and kill the things, or scale up the things that did work. And they're acting their way to a new culture, which changes things a lot. The last part, again, is about scaling your lessons learned. So often when we hear a lot about scaling frameworks, and you're going to hear a fantastic talk from Dan, I'm sure, later today about this, is that you don't create high-performance scaled frameworks by having a stand-up at 9:15 because this one innovation team over here has a stand-up at 9:15 and everybody needs to do that. It's about finding out the methods and models that work well for you in your context. Right? The reason I would argue most people are here today is they're interested to hear stories. Right? They're interested to hear lessons learned from other domains about things that worked and things that didn't. And you'll take those stories and you'll sort of run them against your internal mental model of the world. Because it's impossible for me to understand your domain the way you do, right? You know it way better than anyone. But I'm going to share some stories I already have about where we tried certain things. And I guarantee you're sitting there going, well, how would that work in my space? Maybe I'd tweak it a little bit here. Actually, we could do something like that. That's how you scale stories, is you get people to, scale innovation is get people to share stories of what's working and what's not. Even more powerful, get people inside the company to share those stories. Because when you have those people saying it's not going to work here, we're different, we're too regulated, we're too big, we're too bureaucratic, it debunks those when you have people inside your company sharing stories of innovation that they're doing and breaking people's mental model or their belief that it's not possible. Super, super powerful thing, and I'll share a lot more about this in my talk, okay? So this is sort of like these 10 principles that I want you to sort of think about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you probably, I'd say, 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, actually. And I want you to sort of reflect on those sort of 10 principles that I just shared. And I want you to try and go through, like, as if it was your strategy that you're trying to build, right? Ask yourself these questions, like, what are some of the obstacles you're facing in each one of these principles or not? What are some of the things that are working well? And then we're going to use a technique from a lot of facilitation stuff I use is from Deliberate Structures. Really recommend people check it out. It's called 1, 2, 4, all. And what you're going to do is work on your own for a bit. Then you're going to share with somebody beside you, 2. Then you go into a little bigger group of 4. And then I'll call on a couple of people to share some of the insights that they got from filling it out. Does that sound okay? Okay, so you've got now 9 minutes to fill out or revisit what you had captured while we were talking. Off you go. Work on your own. Okay, so this is sort of what I want you to think about too as well, right? So when I sort of hone in on which one of these squares or whatever it might be that we think actually where we need to focus our efforts, I then start to try and apply a scientific method process on that square, right? So anybody who hangs out with me knows that I'm a big advocate of basically, this is the only probably method I would talk about quite a lot, simply because it's just an expression of the scientific method. And the idea being that it's a teachable way to scientifically think and also act. So it's the improvement KATA. And this is essentially, Mike Rother lived in Cologne for 3 years to try and understand what's the sort of behavior of the Toyota production system, what's the sort of meta team to take away from it. And the example is that they select a challenge, right, or a direction that they're trying to get to. They have an expression of what the current condition of the system is, a sort of shorter term target condition that they're aiming for. This is their planning process, the what, and then people figure out the how about how to move there. So just to sort of illustrate this, Toyota would have an organizational challenge to have 0% emission from their cars by 2020. And an example of the current condition might be if you're on the Prius team, it's currently like 11%. And their target condition for that year at an organizational planning cycle might be to move it to 7%. Or they might choose for the next quarter, they move it from 11 to like 9.5. And that's when the leadership stop. They've defined the outcomes that they're looking to try and achieve, and then the teams come up with the experiments to try and get there. At the bank I described, we want to have business agility. The current condition and target condition we're aiming for is 80% of customers say X, and then they start to encourage the teams to figure out experiments to try and get there. One of the subtleties of this method that is often missed is that people, and depending on the company you're in, when I put up this idea of a target condition, everybody starts lowballing a target condition because they like to practice what I call experiment theater, which is basically just defining an outcome that you know you can hit, and then, so you don't get shouted at or you get your bonus. But counterintuitively, the idea with a target condition is it's meant to be beyond your knowledge threshold. And the reason you try and put things beyond your knowledge threshold is it forces you to behave in a different way or experimenting with different behaviors to get there. The simple example in continuous delivery is, I remember in 2010 when we started talking to people about deploying software hundreds of times a second, when they were working in a company that would deploy, every 6 months or even every month, they thought you were crazy. Because what people do is they map their existing behaviors onto that system of delivering every second, and they say it's not possible. But again, because it's beyond your knowledge threshold, you start to have to experiment with how would we do that? And that's what forces us to change our behavior, engage automation, work in smaller batches. That's what allowed people to move from 6 months to a month to a minute to a second. You have to change your behaviors. So what I want you to do in the last 15 minutes we have is I want you to try and define a KATA experiment for one of the squares on your table. And I want you to try and think about, well, actually, what is the challenge I'm trying to solve? Do I have a good expression of what that actually is? Are we transforming because the CEO told me to do it? Or do you have an idea even for that very specific box? What's the challenge you're trying to solve? And then can you have a good outcome-based description about how the current condition is? The hack is to tell yourself a story about some of the things that are happening now and how frequently or quantify how those things are happening. And then try and come up with a target condition. So something, let's say, in the next month. Tell yourself another story about what might be happening if you were moving towards solving the challenge based on the current condition you are and the target condition you're trying to get to. What would that look like? Trying to find those outcomes and quantify them. And then for bonus point, you can come up with 1 or 2 experiments you think that you could run when you go home tomorrow to try and move towards that target condition. Sound okay? So I'll give you 5 minutes to do it, 5 minutes to do a share back, and then 5 minutes to do just high fives before lunch. Sound okay? Okay, off you go. You got your 5 minutes to design an experiment. Okay, cool. Well, that's great, everybody. I hope you've had a good chance to sort of think about those. I always like to add the one more thing, though, before, because I'm not wearing a turtleneck, but anyway. Often people say to me with transformations that they've got to wait for this perfect moment, wait for the stakeholders to be bought in, wait till they can do delivery in a certain way, wait. And it's such a fallacy. Literally, you're never going to have the perfect conditions. You just got to start where you are. And that's why it's important, again, to get a broad picture of all the places that are moving and just limit your target. Where are you going to start and build from there? Because the top tip for today is this. Stop doing transformation programs. It's about transforming continuously. The world is only going to keep changing. The way you work is going to only keep changing. Having the Phoenix project every 3 years is the biggest waste of investment of energy and time. So transform continuously. And again, when you leave here today, think of the one, hopefully, experiment that you've written down and go execute it, right? Because if I do come back to SEACON next year, I'd love for people to be here to tell me that they did this exercise, they came up with an experiment, and that started them on their journey to a different type of performance. So I just want to thank everybody for showing up. I've never actually facilitated this amount of people in a workshop, so if anybody's any feedback, I'd really appreciate that about what they liked or didn't like. But one lesson I heard from Edward Tufte about doing a good workshop is start on time and finish a little early. So there's 1 minute before lunch. Go get to the queue and get yourself something nice to eat, okay? Thanks very much.